So let's begin. So this is the fourth in a monthly series of talks on the fundamentals of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and Savitri. And each talk is covering one of the central principles in his philosophy and examining how it's described in both his prose writings and in Savitri. The prose writings give us a more precise mental conception of the principle, and the quotes in Savitri then give a more intuitive and experiential sense of it. The talks are conceived more as a recitation of carefully selected passages from Sri Aurobindo's writings rather than an original perspective, although I'll briefly highlight or summarize the key ideas in each of the passages. Earlier talks in the series focused on Sri Aurobindo's conception and descriptions of the divine, of the process of involution and evolution, and of the psychic being. And this presentation will discuss three interrelated concepts: fate, karma, and free will. Usually we think of fate as a predetermined destiny imposed on us by some mysterious outer power, usually conceived as a power of the gods, but sometimes just by the circumstances in which we happen to be born. Karma is usually conceived as a mechanism of cause and effect of our actions, in which our actions have certain corresponding consequences on us in this life or in future lives. And thus the present circumstances of our life are viewed as determined largely by our actions in previous lives. And often karma is viewed in an overly ethical or judicial perspective, such that we're rewarded for good deeds and punished for bad deeds that we may have committed in previous lives. But Sri Aurobindo rejects this view and ascribes to a more complex conception of karma. And finally, free will is usually conceived as a free and independent will to make our own choices in life. And thus it would seem to be largely incompatible with both karma and fate. In Sri Aurobindo's view, as we'll see, this free will applies more to our inner soul or spirit rather than to our surface mind and mental will that we normally exercise in day-to-day life, though that freedom of the soul has its effects and implications for our mental will and its choices, as we'll see. Sri Aurobindo integrates these three important concepts in his view of life. So let's see first how he describes them in his prose writings and afterwards in Savitri. The first few passages are from Letters on Yoga 1, which are followed by a few passages from his small book, The Problem of Rebirth, which is included in his complete works in the volume called Essays in Philosophy and Yoga. So the first passage I'll read is from Letters on Yoga 1, pages 527, 528. And it gives us a wide general perspective in which to view the three concepts. So Sri Aurobindo says, in a general way, a life is only one brief episode in a long history of spiritual evolution, in which the soul follows the curve of the line set for the earth, passing through many lives to complete it. It is an evolution out of material inconscience to consciousness and on to divine consciousness, from ignorance to divine knowledge, from darkness through half-lights to light, from death to immortality, from suffering to the divine bliss. Suffering is due first to the ignorance Secondly, to the separation of the individual consciousness from the divine consciousness and being, a separation created by the ignorance. When that ceases, when one lives completely in the divine and no more in one's separated, smaller self, then only suffering can altogether cease. So we get first here a very wide and long view of the whole process of life and rebirth, that it is an evolution from inconscious to consciousness and up towards divine consciousness through many lives, and that suffering is due to the separation of the individual from the larger divine consciousness of which it's a part. And only when that division is healed can suffering cease. And in a way, the passage is a description of our fate, the overall evolutionary journey our soul has undertaken, its destination, as well as the vicissitudes we must encounter along the way. The next passage gives us a view of the process of rebirth. It is the soul, the eternal divine element within each of us that is evolving here within the conditions of physical, vital, and mental nature, and organizing and integrating that nature around itself over many lifetimes, and using that evolving nature as its instruments of a growing self-expression. So this passage is from Letters on Yoga 1, pages 534 to 535. The soul takes birth each time, and each time a mind, life, and body are formed out of the materials of universal nature, according to the soul's past evolution and its need for the future. When the body is dissolved, the vital goes into the vital plane and remains there for a time. But after a time, the vital sheath disappears. The last to dissolve is the mental sheath. Finally, the soul, or psychic being, retires into the psychic world to rest there till a new birth is due. This is the general course for ordinarily developed human beings. There are variations according to the nature of the individual and his development. For example, if the mental is strongly developed, then the mental being can remain. So also can the vital, provided they are organized by and centered around the true psychic being. They share the immortality of the psychic. The soul gathers the essential element of its experiences in life and makes that its basis of growth in the evolution. When it returns to birth, it takes up with its mental, vital, and physical sheath so much of its karma as is useful to it in the new life for farther experience. So it is the soul and its growing soul personality, the psychic being, that creates a mental and vital and physical body from the materials of universal nature for each life. And after death, these outer bodies usually dissolve back into the universal nature, and the soul goes to the psychic world for a period of rest and preparation for its next life. But to the extent that the mind or vital nature are organized around the psychic being, they too can persist and share in its immortality. And the last sentence about karma here is important. It says that each time the soul creates a new body, life, and mind for its next birth, it takes up along with these as much of its past karma that is useful for it, for its continued experience and evolution. So karma is not simply a rigid machinery. Our actions may have consequences for the evolution of our soul in future lives, but the soul chooses how much of this karma it will work out in the coming lifetime. Some of it may be reserved for future lives to work out. Of course, much of the karma or consequences of our actions are faced in the present life itself. It does not all carry over into future lives. The next passage describes how both positive and negative experiences are viewed or are used by the soul in its evolutionary progression. This comes from Letters on Yoga 1, page 509. He says, "Each follows in the world his own line of destiny, which is determined by his own nature and actions. The meaning and necessity of what happens in a particular life cannot be understood except in the light of the whole course of many lives. But this can be seen by those who can get beyond the ordinary mind and feelings and see things as a whole, that even errors, misfortunes, calamities are steps in the journey, the soul gathering experience as it passes through and beyond them until it is ripe for the transition which will carry it beyond these things to a higher consciousness and higher life. When one comes to that line of crossing, one has to leave behind one the old mind and feelings. One looks then on those who are still fixed in the pleasures and sorrows of the ordinary world with sympathy, and wherever it is possible, with spiritual helpfulness, but no longer with attachment. One learns that they are being led through all their stumblings and trusts to the universal power that is watching and supporting their existence to do for them whatever for them is the best. But the one thing that is really important for us is to get into the greater light and the divine union, to turn to the divine alone, to put our trust there alone, whether for ourselves or for others. The passage gives a few important insights. First, each soul is following a line of development over the course of many lives, which is determined by his own nature and actions. This suggests that our actions are important in determining our line of development. It gives importance to both our choices and will and to their consequences. Secondly, it indicates that even our errors and misfortunes are steps on the journey and that the soul is learning and growing through these. They are a necessary part of the evolutionary process in the ignorance and through the ignorance. Thirdly, a time comes in our development when we can pass beyond the restrictions of our ignorant nature and its growth through error and consequent suffering, and enter into our true spiritual being and into union with the divine. And for that we have to leave behind the attachments to the world and to others, leaving them to the divine power to guide and lead them towards their higher destiny. The next passage gives a closer view of these two stages in the soul's evolution. One in the ignorance and one when we enter into the spiritual life and into our spiritual being. It's also from Letters on Yoga 1, page 509 to 510. Destiny in the rigid sense applies only to the outer being so long as it lives in ignorance. What we call destiny is only, in fact, the result of the present condition of the being and the nature and energies it has accumulated in the past, acting on each other and determining the present attempts and their future results. But as soon as one enters the path of spiritual life, this old predetermined destiny begins to recede. There comes in a new factor, the divine grace, the help of a divine power, a divine force, other than the force of karma, which can lift the sadhak beyond the present possibilities of his nature. One spiritual destiny is then the divine election which ensures the future. The only doubt is about the vicissitudes of the path and the time to be taken by the passage. It is here that the hostile forces, playing on the weaknesses of the past nature, strive to prevent the rapidity of the progress and to postpone the fulfillment. Sri Auroville says, our destiny is the result of the present condition of our being and nature and energies it has accumulated in the past, which are acting on our present actions and their future results. But he says as soon as we enter the path of spiritual life, this changes. This destiny begins to recede, and a new factor comes in, the divine grace. And a higher divine force lifts the sadhak out of his present conditions. Then one's destiny becomes a spiritual destiny, only it may take a longer or shorter time to be fulfilled. The hostile forces may continue to play on one's weaknesses in order to delay the spiritual fulfillment. Next, I will read two passages from Sri Aurobindo's The Problem of Rebirth, from the chapter called Karma, Will, and Consequence. This whole chapter is very illuminating on this subject, and in the first passage, which these are included in the volume called Essays in Philosophy and Yoga, pages 351 to 352, Sri Aurobindo makes a capital distinction between the spirit's will and the mechanism of karma and its consequences. I'll read it in two parts and comment on each. He says, will, karma, and consequence are the three steps of the energy which moves the universe. But karma and consequence are only the outcome of will, or even its forms. Will gives to them their value, and without it they would be nothing. Nothing, at least to man, the thinking and growing soul, and nothing, it may be hazarded, to the spirit, of which he is a flame and power as well as a creature. The thing we first see, or imagine we see, when we look at the outward mechanism of the universe, is energy and its works, action, and consequence. But by itself, and without the light of an inhabiting will, this working is only a huge soulless mechanism, a loud rattling of crank and pulley, a monstrous pounding of spring and piston. It is the presence of the spirit and its will that gives a meaning to the action, and it is the value of the result to the soul that gives its profound importance to all great or little consequence. It would not matter to anyone or anything, not even to the cosmos itself, though this universal stir came to an end tomorrow or had never been created, if these suns and systems were not the field of a consciousness which there rolls out its powers, evolves its works, enjoys its creations, plans and exalts in its immense aims and sequences. Spirit and consciousness and power of the spirit and the nada are the meaning of existence. Take away the spiritual significance and this world of energy becomes a mechanical fortuity or a blind and rigid maya. Fortuity is something just occurring by chance. The implication of this is that whereas there is a mechanism of karma, behind this mechanism is the will of the spirit. Or to put it more forcefully, karma is a mechanism used by the spirit to work out its conscious will. The passage continues. The life of man is a portion of this vast significance. And since it is in him that on this material plane it comes out in its full capacity of meaning, a very important and central portion. The will in the universe works up to him in the creative steps of its energy and makes of his nature a chariot of the gods on which it stands within the action, looks out on its works from the very front, and no longer only from behind or above nature's doings, and moves on to the ultimate consequences and the complete evolution of its purpose. The will of man is the agent of the eternal for the unveiling of the secret meaning in the material creation. Man's mind takes up all the knots of the problem and works them out by the power of the spirit within him and brings them nearer to the full force and degree of their individual and cosmic solutions. This is his dignity and his greatness, and he needs no other to justify and give a perfect value to his birth and his acts and his passing and his return to birth, a return which must be. And what is there in it to grieve at or shun? Until the work of the eternal is in him is perfected, or the cycles rest from the glory of their labor. The paragraph emphasizes the importance of man and man's will in the working out of the Spirit's will in the creation. In the steps of evolution before mankind, the divine will works out its aim without the conscious participation of its creatures. But in man, this will, which is secretly working in all movements in the universe, begins to come out from behind the veil of secrecy and uses man's mind and conscious will as instruments to effectuate its aims. It begins working out its will with the conscious participation of the human being, using man's thought and will to work out the problems and discords of existence and lead it to the full expression of the divine and earthly life, which is its aim in the evolution on earth. The next passage which comes a little later in the same chapter on pages 354, 355, also clarifies the distinction between our soul and our outer nature of mind, life, and body. He says, our present will and personality are bound by many things, by our physical and vital heredity, by a past creation of our mental nature, by environmental forces, by limitation, by ignorance. But our soul behind is greater and older than our present personality. The soul is not the result of this heredity, but has prepared by its own action and affinities this heredity. It has drawn around it these environmental forces by past karma and consequence. It has created in other lives the mental nature of which now it makes use. The ancient soul of long-standing, sempiternal in being, Purushaha, Puranaha, Sanatanaha, has accepted the outward limitation, the outward ignorance, as a means of figuring out in a restriction of action from moment to moment the significance of its infinity and the sequence of its works of power. To live in this knowledge, I think this is one of the most important sentences in the talk. To live in this knowledge is not to take away the value and potency of the moment's will and act, but to give it an immensely increased meaning and importance. Then each moment becomes full of things infinite and can be seen taking up the work of a past eternity and shaping the work of a future eternity. Our every thought, will, action carries with it its power of future self-determination and is too a help or a hindrance for the spiritual evolution of those around us and a force in the universal working. For the soul in us takes in the influences it receives from others for its own self-determination and gives out influences which the soul in them uses for their growth and experience. Our individual life becomes an immensely greater thing in itself and is convinced too of an abiding unity with the march of the universe. The passage makes several important points. First, it admits that our outer nature is not free. It is bound by many things, including our heredity, our environment, and is in itself, in its nature, limited and ignorant. But secondly, our soul is not bound by these things. It has itself shaped our heredity, our environment, and our limited mental and vital nature. It has accepted this limited outer nature in which to dwell, to work out this phase of its evolutionary adventure from inconscience to a divine life. Thirdly, this existence of the soul within and its use of the outer nature to work out its purposes and manifestation gives the outer life vastly increased significance. It's no longer just an accidental or a meaningless event in the complexities and immensities of universal existence. But each of our actions carries an importance for our future self-determination and also has importance for the world around us which receives our influences, and which is also evolving along with us and determining its future course of development. Now let's see how Auroville has described these issues in Savitri. And in the first passage, we'll see how and why our souls, once seated in the bliss of the divine, have chosen this adventure of evolution from the inconscient to divine consciousness, through all the difficulties of the long journey, through countless lives. It comes in a long explanation by Narad, the heavenly sage, about fate. It's on pages 454, 455. And I'll read it in 3 parts and comment on it. O mortal, who complainest of death and fate, accuse none of the harms thyself hast called. This troubled world thou hast chosen for thy home. Thou art thyself the author of thy pain. Once in the immortal boundlessness of self, in a vast of truth and consciousness and light, the soul looked out from its felicity. It felt the Spirit's interminable bliss. It knew itself deathless, timeless, spaceless, one. It saw the eternal, lived in the infinite. Then, curious of a shadow thrown by truth, it strained towards some otherness of self. It was drawn to an unknown face peering through night. It sensed a negative infinity, a void supernal, whose immense excess, imitating God and everlasting time, offered a ground for nature's adverse birth and matter's rigid, hard unconsciousness, harboring the brilliance of a transient soul that lights up birth and death and ignorant life. The passage gives an image of the soul looking out from its seat in the infinite divine self and seeing a shadow of this self, a negative infinity, and became curious of the shadow and straining towards it as if drawn to an unknown face peering at it through the darkness. And as it gazes into the darkness, it sees a world, a life based on matter's hard unconsciousness, a transient, ignorant life lit by a soul. And next, he says, a mind arose that stared at nothingness, till figures formed of what could never be. It housed the contrary of all that is. A naught appeared as being's huge sealed cause, its dumb support in a blank infinite, in whose abysm spirit must disappear. A darkened nature lived and held the seed of spirit hidden and fading not to be. Eternal consciousness became a freak of an unsouled, almighty inconscient, and breathed no more as spirit's native air. Bliss was an incident of a mortal hour, a stranger in the insentient universe. So as the soul is gazing into this dark shadow, a consciousness, a mind arose, staring into nothingness. A naught or nothingness appeared, which now seemed to be the cause of everything. The conscious spirit became hidden from this darkened mind, as if pretending it did not exist. And thus was born the inconscient, which held the seed of the spirit, but could feel it no more. And continues. As one drawn by the grandeur of the void, the soul attracted leaned to the abyss. It longed for the adventure of ignorance and the marvel and surprise of the unknown and the endless possibility that lurked in the womb of chaos and in nothing's gulf, or looked from the unfathomed eyes of chance. It tired of its unchanging happiness. It turned away from immortality. It was drawn to hazard's call and danger's charm. It yearned to the pathos of grief, the drama of pain, perdition's peril, the wounded bare escape, the music of ruin and its glamour and crash, the savor of pity and the gamble of love and passion and the ambiguous face of fate. The soul sensed the possibility of itself adventuring into this darkness, taking birth on matters rigid, hard, unconsciousness, moving through its various possibilities of experience, and took the plunge. In the next passage, which comes a few pages later and is still part of Nara's explanation of the nature of fate, he says that our fate is not the hardships that we face in day-to-day living in the long journey through many lives, but the goal of the journey and the road that we choose to follow. It comes on pages 458 to 459, and I'll read it in two parts. O man, the events that meet thee on thy road, though they smite thy body and soul with joy and grief, are not thy fate. They touch thee a while and pass. Even death can cut not short thy spirit's walk. Thy goal, the road thou choosest, are thy fate. On the altar, throwing thy thoughts, thy heart, thy works, thy fate is a long sacrifice to the gods, till they have opened to thee thy secret self, and made thee one with the indwelling God. O soul, intruder in nature's ignorance, armed traveler to the unseen supernal heights, thy spirit's fate is a battle and a ceaseless march against invisible opposing powers, a passage from matter into timeless self, adventure through blind, unforeseen time, a forced advance through a long line of lives. It pushes its spearhead through the centuries. In this part of the passage, Sri Aurobindo puts our adventure into the ignorance into context and relation with the gods and the opponent powers. We have become as if soldiers in the battle between these gods, a war which is being waged through the centuries, and we, in life after life, are fighting on the front lines. Also, he says that the nature of our fight is a sacrifice to the gods. Unconscious at first, but as we more and more offer our thoughts and feelings and actions to the divine, our true divine self will be open to us and won. The passage continues. Across the dust and mire of the earthly plain, on many guarded lines and dangerous fronts, in dire assaults, in wounded, slow retreats, holding the ideal's ruined and battered fort, or fighting against odds in lonely posts, or camped at night around the bivouac's fires, awaiting the tardy trumpets of the dawn, in hunger and in plenty and in pain, through peril and through triumph and through fall, through life's green lanes and over her desert sands, up the bald moor, along the sunlit ridge, in serried columns with a straggling rear, led by its nomad vanguard's signal fires, marches the army of the way-lost God. Then late the joy ineffable is felt. Then he remembers his forgotten self. He has refound the skies from which he fell. At length, his front's indomitable line forces the last passes of the ignorance, advancing beyond nature's last known bounds, reconnoitering the formidable unknown, beyond the landmarks of things visible. He mounts through a miraculous upper air, till climbing the mute summit of the world, he stands upon the splendor peaks of God. Sri Aurobindo poetically illustrates the long, difficult march of the army of the way-lost God, the army of souls who are lost and searching their way back to the divine consciousness in the dust and mire of the earthly plane. It's interesting that he brings in this collective nature of the effort. It's not just one individual soul, but an army of souls who are marching together in tight rows and columns with a straggling rear, with some scattered individuals behind struggling to keep up. And finally, they move through the mountains, through the last passes of the ignorance, into a miraculous upper air on the summits of the world, and stand on the splendor peaks of God. The next passage describes the nature of karma, of the chain of our actions and their consequences, which seems to restrain our evolutionary journey, but at the same time keeps it in an orderly and directed course, rather than a haphazard wandering. And here we see that there are higher beings or Godheads who oversee this process. It comes on pages 377, 378. a guidance turn the dumb revolving wheels, and in the eager body of their speed, the dim-masked, hooded Godheads rode, who move, a sign to man immutably from his birth, receivers of the inner and outer law, at once the agents of his Spirit's will, and witnesses and executors of his fate. Inexorably faithful to their task, they hold his nature's sequence in their guard, carrying the unbroken thread old lives have spun, attendance on his destiny's measured walk, leading to joys he has won and pains he has called. Even in his casual steps they intervene. Nothing we think or do is void or vain. Each is an energy loosed and holds its course. The shadowy keepers of our deathless past have made our fate the child of our own acts. And from the furrows labored by our will, we reap the fruit of our forgotten deeds. The passage is particularly interesting in its depiction of these Godheads who are assigned to man immutably from his birth, and who are at once the agents of his Spirit's will and the witnesses and executors of his fate. They hold his nature's sequence in their guard, the unbroken thread all lives have spun. And moreover, they are inexorably faithful to their task. Nothing we think or do is void or vain. Each is an energy and holds its course. Every thought, every desire, every action is an energy which has its consequences upon our future, however unconscious we may be of their effects. The passage continues, and it refers at the end to Savitri's fate and journey. But since unseen the tree that bore this fruit, and we live in a present born from an unknown past, they seem but parts of a mechanic force, to a mechanic mind tied by earth's laws, yet are the instruments of a will supreme, watched by a still, all-seeing eye above, a prescient architect of fate and chance, who builds our lives on a foreseen design, the meaningness and consequence of each step, and watches the inferior stumbling powers. Upon her silent heights she was aware of a calm presence throned above her brows, who saw the goal and chose each fateful curve. It used the body for its pedestal. The eyes that wandered were its searchlight fires. The hands that held the reins, its living tools. All was the working of an ancient plan, a way proposed by an unerring guide. The passage is interesting in its depiction of an overseeing divine presence, described as a will supreme, still, all-seeing eye above, and appreciate, that is, having foreknowledge of events, architect of fate and chance. We think that things happen just like that, by happenstance. But everything, each fateful curve, is foreseen and designed by this divine architect. Our eyes, our hands, are the living tools of this calm, divine presence which is working out an ancient plan. If we put it in philosophical language, you might say that all that happens in our lives is being overseen and guided by the Jivatman, our divine individual self, seated above the manifestation but watching over the journey of its representative soul in the earthly nature, our psychic being, with its instruments of mind, life, and body. The next passage, a short passage which comes on page 465, highlights again the distinction between our soul and our outer nature and brings out the importance of our identification of our soul rather than our outer nature. Of course, this shift in our identification, in our identity, is one of the main goals of the yoga. It is the realization of the psychic being. This shift can only happen when the soul has sufficiently developed in the course of its evolution and the outer nature has been sufficiently purified and refined to enable it. Nevertheless, it is our psychic being's constant aim. And to the extent that we can align our outer nature with that aim, we can assist its coming forward to rule the outer nature and our life. This should be our constant aspiration, or if not yet constant, our persistent aspiration through all the vicissitudes of life, through all our ups and downs. The passage begins, "Fate followed her foreseen, immutable road. Man's hopes and longings build the journeying wheels that bear the body of his destiny and lead his blind will towards an unknown goal. His fate within him shapes his acts and rules. Its face and form are already born in him. Its parentage is in his secret soul. Here matter seems to mold the body's life, and the soul follows where its nature drives. Nature and fate compel his free will's choice. But greater spirits this balance can reverse and make the soul the artist of its fate. This is the mystic truth our ignorance hides. Doom is a passage for our inborn force. Our ordeal is the hidden spirit's choice. Ananki is our being's own decree. So we see that as long as we're centered in our outer being, it seems as if the soul follows where our nature drives. But actually, our soul has given its consent to allow our nature to drive, that it may grow and learn through experience of disappointment, struggle, error, and developing self-mastery. That is what Sri Aurobindo says in the last two lines. Our ordeal is the hidden spirit's choice. Ananki, that is necessity, is our being's own decree. Even doom is a passage for our inborn force. Even through the experience of death, we can grow. Our inborn force persists through this passage and can grow stronger by its experience. But he also explains that we can reverse this balance and make the soul the artist of its fate, no longer allowing itself to be led by the outer nature. The soul can take up the reins of the nature. And this is the psychic realization and the psychic transformation that is so important in this yoga. One final passage further describes this crucial turning point when the soul takes a conscious control and mastery over the nature, rather than allowing the nature to slowly follow its evolutionary course through the outer mechanisms of karma and rebirth. It comes on page 12 and describes this critical point in Savitri's life. That hour had fallen now on Savitri, a point she had reached where life must be in vain, or, in her unborn element awake, her will must cancel her body's destiny. For only the unborn spirit's timeless power can lift the yoke imposed by birth in time. Only the self that builds this figure of self can raise the fixed interminable line that joins these changing names, these numberless lives, these new oblivious personalities, and keep still lurking in our conscious acts the trail of old forgotten thoughts and deeds. Disown the legacy of our buried selves, the burdensome heirship to our vanished forms, accepted blindly by the body and soul. An episode in an unremembered tale, its beginning lost, its motive and plot concealed. A once living story has prepared and made our present fate, child of past energies. The fixity of the cosmic sequences, fastened with hidden, inevitable links. She must disrupt, dislodge by her soul's force, her past, a block on the immortal's road. Make a raised ground and shape anew her fate. Sri Auroville shows here both the burdensome heirship of karma and its effects upon our lives, and the way to cancel it, to raise or demolish it. This karma, he says, is accepted blindly by the body and soul. The soul gives its sanction to it, and the body suffers it, is carried in its force. In order to cancel it, Savitri, but it also applies to us, must become awake in her unborn element. Because only the unborn spirit's timeless power can lift the yoke imposed by birth and time. This unborn spirit would again seem to be the Jivatman, this individual self, or perhaps its representative in the evolution, the soul. Towards the end, he says, she must disrupt, dislodge by her soul's force, her past. The Spirit alone can make a raised ground and shape anew her fate. The Spirit, or Jivatman, has the free will. It is not subject to karma. It can shape anew its fate. So we see from Sri Aurobindo's writings here that the issues of fate and karma and free will are complexly intertwined. It may be useful as a conclusion to briefly summarize the key points that he's covered in these writings. 1. In a general sense, our long-term fate or destiny is our evolutionary journey from inconscience to divine consciousness over a span of innumerable earthly lives, a journey which our soul has itself chosen to undertake. 2. Our fate or destiny for our present life is the working out of the results of the energies developed and expressed in our past evolution and our present life, all acting on each other and with the environment and influencing the present condition of our life and our present choices. 3. The effects or results of our past expressions of energy and the present conditions of our life and consciousness is called karma. Karma is a mechanism or process of nature which keeps the development and evolution of our individual soul and nature in a sensible and meaningful line of progression, rather than a haphazard manifestation of different possibilities. 4. Our soul is evolving here along with our nature, and prior to its rebirth in each life, the soul itself forms its mental, vital, and physical nature out of the materials of universal nature and from its past personalities developed in previous lives. When it forms its outer nature, it takes up as much of its previous karma as it wishes to work out in the present life. Thus, although there are karmic consequences of our thoughts and actions of previous lives, all of this karma is not necessarily worked out in the succeeding life. Some may be held in reserve. Some may have been worked out in the same life it was generated. The laws of karma apply primarily to the outer nature, not the soul, which constructs the nature as its means of expression in the world and the vehicle of its own evolution. It is the soul behind which determines its nature each life and the amount of karma it wishes to work out for the furtherance of its evolutionary progression. 6. Whereas in lower forms of life, the mechanism of karma is largely determinative of the conditions of the nature and life, in humans, the soul behind begins to utilize the mental choice and will to express itself and shape the direction and speed of its future evolution. Thus, our mental will and its choices have a significant importance in our development and future. Although our mental will and choice are not completely free, being a part of nature, they carry a relative freedom as semi-conscious instruments of the evolving soul that is behind and using them. And 7. As the soul evolves sufficiently to turn the life of the individual to the spiritual life, the influence of the past karma begins to recede, and the greater freedom of the Spirit becomes prominent. The action of the divine grace overrides the karmic consequences, linking us to our past, and opens up new possibilities for our future development. When we unite our consciousness with the spiritual consciousness, we can erase our past karma and shape our own destiny in accordance with the divine will.
I remember at a certain point reading Savitri, a passage where Schrödinger talks directly about karma, and something that shocked me because my learning from Buddhism, karma is a consequence of past actions that reflects in the future. What he was saying there, which is also what you're saying, is that it's not something that automatically or from external forces influences our future. It is our soul that knows what we are doing in this life, and we decide what is our karma. Does it fit with your vision? And did I interpret right?
Yeah, except just in the last few words, it sounded like you were a little too dismissive of karma. I mean, I think that it's a mechanism that has its, strong effects, quite inevitable almost links, okay? But still, the soul, as he said here, it takes up as much of that karma as it wants to work out in the next life. It doesn't have to take it all. Okay, so there's some flexibility. And then, although I don't know that he brought it out so much, but I tried to also bring out, I think that to some extent, we shouldn't just think of karma as always passing to the next life. Because, we all face the consequences of our actions in this life also, right? We're constantly dealing with things that, the consequences of our choices, our actions. So we're dealing with it also in our present life. It doesn't all have to carry over, I think, to the next life. We also face those consequences now. And then somehow all of this, what he emphasizes, it's a mechanism being used by the Spirit. It's a mechanism, let's say, even devised by the Spirit to unroll its powers over time. And so it can also override that mechanism. It's its own mechanism, right? So there is also that possibility that it can erase karma, or it can, so there is also that possibility. So it's something that's used by the Spirit, by the soul within. So in that sense, I think it brings in certain flexibility or subtlety within it. Then again, I don't go into it, but when you look into this book, The Problem of Rebirth, the complexities of karma are quite extraordinary. Because it's like, the way that it works, its effects kind of follow the particular line relating to that action, or that thought, or that feeling. It doesn't spread out. Usually we think of it in terms of good and bad consequences. We think of it in this kind of black and white kind of terms, and then we think, if, I committed some offense to somebody. Let's say I insulted somebody very badly and put them down. So then, what kind of consequence would that have on me? Well, he talks about it being very much in line with that type of energy which is expended, that same type of energy. The consequence comes in that, not in something else. It doesn't mean that, I'm going to have less money next time, or I'm going to, be born in some terrible condition, or, it's just like, it's very nuanced, related to that particular expenditure of energy. So those are some of the complexities of it. And so, in some ways, it's not a rigid machinery. I think we can say that much.
I found revolutionary vision of Sri Aurobindo giving more importance to our soul, mostly looking at the future, not very much to the consequences in this life of what is our past karma, but in determining our future karma. That is, I saw, very, very much, shift from the Buddhist point of view, which is much more, automatic in a sense. If I kill an animal, I will transform into an animal, this type of easy things. For him, it's much deeper, as you say, it's much vaster too.
And then we have to recognize, usually Sri Aurobindo is, talking in the context of yoga and spiritual practice. And in that sense, then all of this becomes much more relative, because then these higher forces of grace and the divine force comes in that overrides those mechanisms of karma. So then it's more like, you're saying, you don't have to worry about or think about the past so much, or whatever consequences are there, because the divine can lift you out of whatever, consequences you have.
This present karma can vanish at past, and it leads to future also. So main present karma what we are doing is the more valid. And
that was one of the interesting things, that he's saying that all of this it doesn't take away from the importance of our present choices. It's not, our present choices aren't all determined by our past. That there's also, that past is there, it's also part of it, but it's not everything. Because in one place he puts it, we're also kind of a flame of the spirit as well as a creature or something. So also that freedom of the soul is there also as part of us. And so it's also determining its future. But that's the more important thing, what we're doing in the present and its consequences on our future and around those around us. Much more important to look for that.
You can choose, the soul can choose how much of the karma to work it out in the next life, the flexibility which you do. Is there also that karma is basically more collective, though it's always individual to individual life, or it's that it goes to some collective repository and there will be collective consequences to that?
From what I understand or what I recall is that there also is that collective aspect to it. So that like a nation can also develop, have a certain karmic consequences of what it has done in the past. And that inevitably would affect people, you know, who are born in that country, because it's in that milieu in which they're living. But so I think that's there. But it's not necessarily that then, you know, all those individual souls take on that karma or something, because the soul chooses which country also it will live in. So, but for that life in which it's living there, it's in that milieu, maybe it has to kind of, it's in that condition of the country, created by that country's karma. It's going to be affected during that lifetime anyway. It's all pretty complex.
Why is it so complex? Is it like our understanding is complex?
No, it's because
Subject is complex.
no, it's because the nature of reality is this interaction of many different forces at many different levels. And our human mind likes to say, you know, like, well, this I put in this category, and this category, and this category. But the world isn't really like all arranged in categories. You know, it's like everything is fluid and is influencing different aspects.
What I meant to understand is our intellectual limitation or the subject is such a way that I think about understanding it, trying to understand something with a tool which is not really meant for it in sufficiency.
Yeah, well, ultimately, I mean, the mind maybe we only can develop kind of mental pictures, representations of what reality is. To really know reality, actually you have to silence the mind and enter into another state of consciousness. Our mind, we develop maps of reality. And we can develop more or less, you know, sophisticated maps. More complex, more simple, you know, it depends on the subtlety, development of the mind. So he develops a quite complex map of the thing that's also a little bit maybe beyond our mental abilities to follow everything. But ultimately also it's kind of a map that he's giving us. Ultimately the truth is ineffable. It's beyond speech or thought or mind. You can only really know it by becoming one with it. And of course, that's the aim of the spiritual development. These are just like a staff, you know, that we kind of take on the way up to help us understand a little bit as we go forward.